The jeweler's loop shook slightly as the old man squinted at Rachel's wedding ring, his face turning a ghostly shade of pale. Under the harsh fluorescent light, the gold wasn't just dull. It was coated in a strange, neon-orange crust that looked like a slow-growing poison. "This isn't rust, Mrs. Montgomery," he whispered, his voice cracking in the silent shop. "And this didn't come from any steel mill in this valley. This is a chemical catalyst from a toy factory, the kind they only use in a specific district 300 miles from here." Rachel felt the floor tilt beneath her boots. Just yesterday, Thomas had kissed her goodbye, complaining about the grueling heat of the local construction site and the grit of the coal dust on his skin. She looked down at the orange stain now smudging her own palm, realizing the man she had slept next to for a decade hadn't just replaced her ring. He was systematically replacing her entire reality. Somewhere across the state line, her husband was living a life that shouldn't exist, and the evidence was currently burning a hole in her heart. Rachel Montgomery tightened her grip on the strap of her leather bag. The weight of it pulled at her shoulder, a constant reminder of the day's fatigue. Beneath her feet, the soles of her boots crunched against a fine, pervasive layer of coal dust that coated the sidewalks of Steel Valley like a shroud. Above, the sky hung heavy and low, a sheet of laundered gray fabric that allowed only the faintest, most sickly light of a hidden sun to filter through. Rachel paused for a moment before the window of a bakery that had been shuttered for months. She reached out, dragging a single finger across the glass. It left a sharp, distinct trail through a greasy film of soot, revealing the dark void behind the pane. A sudden gust of wind whipped through the narrow alleys, carrying the sharp scent of wet concrete and the lingering, acrid stench of old fires. On the porch of a nearby house, she noticed the paint curling away from the wood in long, dry strips, resembling dead skin sloughing off an unhealed wound. Every building in this block looked like the exhausted face of an old man, etched with deep wrinkles of structural cracks. Rachel lowered her gaze, focusing on the uneven pavement to avoid the hollow, accusing stares of the boarded-up windows. Inside the high school gymnasium, the air usually carried the scent of old rubber mats and stale sweat. But today, a cloying, heavy cloud of the principal's cheap cologne masked everything else. Rachel sat on a rigid metal folding chair, her fingers digging into the edges of her lesson planner until the cardboard began to fray. Up on the makeshift podium, a man in a rumpled suit droned through a prepared statement regarding the permanent mothballing of the Steel Valley Metalworks. Rachel watched the shoulders of Mrs. Green, who sat directly in front of her, slumped forward as if a physical weight had been dropped onto her neck. Her head bowed toward her chest, defeated. A silence settled over the cavernous room, a pressure so dense that the erratic buzzing of a failing fluorescent tube overhead sounded like a scream. Rachel surveyed her colleagues. Their faces had transformed into waxy masks of pure despair. The future of her students, the boys and girls she had taught to analyze Milton and Frost, was disintegrating into ash right beneath the echoing rafters of this gym. Later that evening, Rachel warmed her palms against a steaming mug of tea. The scent of bergamot and the buttery aroma of fresh scones filled the kitchen, providing a temporary sanctuary. Thomas Montgomery sat across from her at the heavy oak table, spreading out glossy travel brochures that depicted the pristine white sands of the Florida coast. Rachel watched the confident, rhythmic movements of his large hands as he used a bright marker to circle small beach houses with wraparound terraces. In the living room, the fireplace crackled with a comforting rhythm, casting dancing orange reflections across the leather spines of the books on the shelves. Rachel felt the jagged tension of the school meeting begin to dissolve, replaced by the radiating warmth of Thomas's massive frame. Here, protected by the thick, familiar walls of their home, she felt nestled in a cocoon, insulated from the slow-motion collapse of Steel Valley. Thomas flashed her a quick, reassuring smile, and Rachel chose to believe that their quiet harbor remained unshakable. Thomas reached into his jacket pocket and produced a small velvet box. With a sharp click of the latch, he revealed a band of shimmering platinum topped with a substantial diamond. Rachel froze, staring at the cold, clinical brilliance of the stone. It looked alien in their modest, dimly lit dining room. Thomas reached out, taking her hand and sliding the old gold wedding band from her ring finger. The old metal was dull, marred by strange, dark discolorations that had appeared over the last few months. Thomas grimaced as he examined the original ring, murmuring that the aggressive industrial chemicals at the plant must have finally corroded the gold beyond repair. Rachel felt the icy, unfamiliar weight of the new band against her skin as Thomas tucked the old one into his pocket. The sparkle of the new diamond was nearly blinding, but she involuntarily clenched her fist, missing the habitual, comforting weight of the old gold that had been with her for a decade. The next morning, Rachel stood on the gravel driveway, pulling her wool cardigan tight against the damp chill of the Pennsylvania dawn. Thomas tossed a heavy, overstuffed duffel bag into the back of his SUV. The metal of the vehicle slick with a layer of fine dew. The engine roared to life with a deep, guttural growl, and for a moment, the gray exhaust fumes enveloped Thomas's figure like a shroud. He leaned out, pressing a hurried kiss to her cheek, leaving behind the fleeting scent of peppermint gum and the dry smell of road dust. The SUV rolled slowly out of the yard, its tires crunching over the grit as it headed toward the interstate leading into Ohio. Rachel watched until the red glow of the taillights vanished behind a bend in the road. She walked back into the house, where the silence felt sudden and deafening, and the empty rooms seemed to expand, becoming far too large for her to occupy alone. Driven by a sudden impulse to organize, Rachel stepped into the garage. She intended to clear the workbench, which had accumulated a thick layer of gray silt over the winter. Amidst the dried-out paint cans and stiffened brushes, her eyes landed on the heavy steel tool chest that Thomas usually kept padlocked. To her surprise, the drawer slid open with a sharp, metallic screech. Inside lay a chaotic sprawl of hex bolts, washers, and rags stiff with black grease. Rachel reached into the back corner, her fingers brushing against a small, crumpled ball of paper towel. She smoothed out the paper, and her breath hitched. There lay her old wedding ring, the one Thomas had promised to trade in or have melted down. The gold sat in her palm, cold and surprisingly heavy, hidden away amongst the rusted iron and sawdust in the dim, shadowed corner of the garage. Rachel moved toward the small, grime-streaked window of the garage to catch a sliver of natural light. She ignored the smell of machine oil clinging to her skin and held the ring up to her eyes. Where the gold should have been smooth and lustrous, she saw a tacky, fine-grained residue of a startlingly bright orange hue. She tried to scrape it with a fingernail, but the substance didn't crumble. It stretched and pulled like a curing polymer or a thick, industrial resin. Rachel touched the tip of her finger to her tongue, instantly regretting it as a sharp, chemical bitterness flooded her mouth, causing her jaw to ache. This wasn't rust, and it certainly wasn't the soot of Steel Valley. The substance felt synthetic and aggressive. A cold shiver traced the line of her spine, and her heart began to hammer a frantic, uneven rhythm against her ribs. The heavy oak door of the town's oldest jewelry shop swung open, causing the bell above the lintel to let out a startled, high-pitched chime. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of lemon furniture polish and the musty smell of old velvet. Rachel placed the ring onto a soft black cloth spread across the counter before a stooped man wearing thick, horn-rimmed glasses. The jeweler picked up the piece with a pair of delicate tweezers, and Rachel watched his silver eyebrows shoot upward as he caught sight of the orange crust. She gripped her handbag, her knuckles white, as the man clicked on a high-powered lamp and pressed a jeweler's loupe to his eye. In the harsh, artificial glare, the orange spots on Rachel's gold ring flared with a poisonous, almost neon intensity, reflecting in the jeweler's dilated pupils. The jeweler set the loupe aside and looked at Rachel with a flicker of poorly concealed suspicion. He leaned over the counter, explaining that the orange residue was a very specific catalyst used in the curing of high-impact polymers for children's toys. Rachel felt the room grow smaller as he named a specific, gated industrial district in Ohio, where that kind of manufacturing was concentrated. He told her the substance was so corrosive that it would only bond to gold like this after days of direct exposure in a high-heat production environment. Rachel felt the collar of her blouse begin to choke her. The man's words about toxic plastics echoed in her skull, systematically erasing every story Thomas had told her about his work on steel-frame skyscrapers and bridge foundations. Back in her car, Rachel gripped the steering wheel so hard her hands began to tremble. She replayed Thomas's recent reports of pouring concrete and hauling rebar for new shopping centers. Not once had he mentioned chemical vats or plastic injection molding. She looked at the faint orange stain on her palm, a mark left behind by the jeweler's inspection, and felt the sheer scale of the deception. Every detail of their planned retirement in Florida now felt like a house of cards built on a foundation of industrial poison. Thomas had lied about every mile he drove and every hour he spent away from her. A cold, calculating fury began to simmer in her gut, displacing the initial shock and leaving her with a terrifying clarity. Rachel hit the call button on her phone, holding the device to her ear and listening to the long, rhythmic pulses of the dial tone. On the fourth ring, the line cut off with a sudden, mechanical click. A second later, the phone in her lap vibrated with an incoming text from Thomas. The message was curt, composed of dry, functional phrases, claiming he was on a loud job site and couldn't talk over the roar of the machinery. Rachel stared at the screen, and the lie felt like it was burning her retinas more fiercely than the chemical on the ring. She threw the phone onto the passenger seat, where it hit the plastic dashboard with a dull thud. The silence in the car became a living thing, ominous and suffocating. Rachel moved through the house with a frantic, focused energy. She threw a change of clothes, a heavy-duty flashlight, and a thick accordion folder of their financial documents into a canvas duffel. She yanked the zipper shut with a violent, rasping sound. Rachel killed the engine, and the vibrations of her old sedan died away, replaced by the eerie, sterile silence of a wealthy suburb. Through the windshield, which was filmed with the fine grit of the interstate, she stared at a lawn so perfectly manicured it looked like artificial turf. The number 42 on the mailbox was cast in heavy, polished brass, gleaming in the afternoon sun with a luster that felt like a direct insult to the rusted street signs of Steel Valley. Rachel checked the coordinates on her GPS against that golden shimmer, her palms slick against the leather wheel. There was no coal dust here. Only the white blossoms of apple trees drifted through the air, scentless and clean. She slipped into the shadows of a massive lilac hedge, ignoring the woody branches that snagged the knit of her cardigan. The cloying scent of the flowers filled her lungs as she pressed her back against the cool brick of the foundation. A sharp click of a deadbolt echoed like a gunshot in the quiet street. Thomas stepped out onto the porch, but he wasn't the man she knew. The soot-stained work clothes were gone. Instead, he wore soft, charcoal gray slacks and a sand-colored cashmere sweater. He stretched, squinting into the sunlight, and Rachel saw a terrifying lightness in his movements, a grace he had never possessed in the cramped, dying rooms of their home in Pennsylvania. The sudden, rhythmic thud of small feet on the wooden deck made Rachel flinch. Two children burst from the house, a boy in a bright blue shirt and a girl with golden curls held back by a silk ribbon. Thomas let out a booming, joyful laugh that echoed off the neighboring houses, and he scooped both of them into his arms at once. Rachel watched as he pressed his face into their hair, a wide, genuine smile transforming his features. The boy wrapped his arms around Thomas's neck in a gesture of absolute trust. The sight was more agonizing to Rachel than a physical blow to the chest. The front door opened again, and a woman stepped out. Her dark hair was pinned up in a loose, messy knot, the exact style Rachel wore every morning. The woman wore a floral print dress that was a near-perfect match for one hanging in Rachel's closet 300 miles away. She walked to Thomas and rested a hand on his shoulder. Rachel watched as the woman stood on her tiptoes to plant a lingering kiss on Thomas's cheek. A flash of sunlight hit the woman's wedding band, and Rachel tasted copper. She had bitten her lip so hard she drew blood, unable to look away from the perfect family tableau. Once Thomas's gleaming SUV had pulled out of the driveway and disappeared. Rachel emerged from the hedge, brushing dried leaves from her sleeves. She moved around to the rear of the house, her boots silent on the mulch. Near the back, she found a small window to the laundry room left slightly ajar. She hoisted herself up, her elbows scraping against the vinyl siding, and tumbled inside. The room smelled of lavender fabric softener, the specific brand Thomas always insisted she buy, claiming the scent helped him decompress after a long week on the construction site. Rachel stepped into the living room and stopped short, grabbing the doorframe to steady herself. It was a hall of mirrors. The room was a meticulously upgraded version of her own home. The walls were covered in the same olive branch wallpaper she had spent weeks picking out 3 years ago. The tan sofa sat at the exact same angle to the fireplace, and a stack of gardening magazines sat on the coffee table. Every detail, from the arrangement of the bookshelves to the specific shade of the throw pillows, screamed that she was standing in a stolen life, a vision of her own desires realized by a stranger. She walked to the mantel, which was crowded with dark wood frames. In the center sat a photo of Thomas, the woman, and the children at a mountain lake. Rachel recognized the composition instantly. It was a mirror image of their own honeymoon photo, down to the tilt of Thomas's head and the way he held the woman's waist. The same smiles, the same lighting. Rachel touched the cold glass of the frame, feeling as though the woman in the photo wasn't a person at all, but a mannequin that had stepped into a script Rachel had written. Her feet felt heavy as she climbed the stairs. She passed doors painted in soft pastels. On the first, blue wooden letters spelled out Leo. On the second, pink letters read Emma. Rachel pressed her hand over her mouth to stifle a sob. These were the names Thomas had whispered to her on cold nights in Steel Valley, the names of the children they would have once the air was clean and the money was right. Inside the rooms, she saw the exact toys and the specific patterned curtains she had once saved to a Dream Home folder on her laptop. In Thomas's home office, the air was chilled by a humming air conditioner. Rachel sat in the leather desk chair and nudged the mouse. The screen flickered to life, revealing a social media profile. The woman, Sarah, had a page filled with photos. Sarah baking an apple pie using Rachel's grandmother's recipe. Sarah planting hydrangeas in the exact geometric pattern Rachel had planned for their backyard. Every post was a stolen memory or a hijacked dream. As Rachel scrolled through the blessed captions, the text blurred into jagged black marks. Rachel leaned back, staring at the ceiling fan's slow rotation. The truth hit her with the force of an avalanche. Thomas hadn't just cheated. He had performed a surgical extraction of Rachel's identity and transplanted it into a new life. Sarah was a surrogate, a living doll playing Rachel's role in a set Thomas deemed perfect. Her habits, her aesthetic, and even her unborn children had been used as blueprints. Rachel realized that to Thomas, she was merely a rough draft, a prototype he had decided to discard in favor of a polished final version. The sound of a heavy engine and the crunch of gravel signaled Thomas's return. Rachel bolted, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She scrambled toward the back door, nearly toppling a vase of dried lavender. She sprinted across the lawn toward the dense line of woods bordering the property. Brambles tore at her slacks and scratched her face, but she didn't slow down. From the safety of the trees, she looked back and saw Thomas unloading grocery bags, laughing at something the boy said. In this sun-drenched world, Rachel felt like a ghost, her only trace the flattened grass she had left behind. Hours later, Rachel sat in her car in the gravel lot of a roadside motel. A neon sign hummed and flickered overhead, casting a rhythmic red glow into the cabin. On the dashboard lay the ring with the orange chemical stain, the only honest thing left in her world. She watched the headlights of passing semi-trucks, their glare momentarily illuminating her hollowed-out expression. 5 years of her life, her labor, and her love had been nothing more than raw material for Thomas to build this. She gripped the wheel, the plastic groaning under her strength. Rachel crossed the Steel Valley city limits just as the air began to vibrate with a low, tectonic roar. The factory whistle, which had once signaled the changing of the guard, now sounded like the final groan of a dying beast. The sound was so massive, it made the windows of Rachel's car rattle in their seals. It went on and on, drowning out the engine, filling every crack in the pavement. On the sidewalks, people stopped dead, covering their ears. A final, pathetic plume of soot belched from the stacks of the mill. And then, the sound cut out. A heavy, suffocating silence descended, leaving only the ticking of her cooling engine. She pushed open her front door, and the smell of stagnant dust and cold ash hit her instantly. In the few days she had been gone, the house had become a tomb. A fine, greasy layer of coal silt had settled over everything, the windowsills, the backs of the chairs, even the spines of her books. Rachel dragged her hand across the dining table, leaving a deep black furrow that exposed the wood beneath. The soot motes danced in a stray beam of light, settling on her shoulders as if the town itself were trying to reclaim her, burying her along with the house. Rachel took 2 starched white napkins from the sideboard and laid them over the soot, creating 2 small islands of cleanliness on the table. She set the porcelain plates down with a sharp, dry clatter and lined up the silver. She didn't bother with candles. The sickly yellow light of the street lamp filtered through the grime on the window. In the center of the table, between the 2 settings, she placed the old gold ring. Against the white fabric, the orange chemical crust looked violent and bright, like a drop of dried blood. She sat down, folded her hands in her lap, and waited for the sound of the key. The screech of the lock echoed through the hallway, and Thomas stepped in, humming a bright, upbeat tune. He tossed his keys onto the small table and walked toward the kitchen without taking off his coat, bringing with him the scent of expensive coffee and the fresh air of Ohio. He stopped at the threshold of the dining room. The melody died in his throat. His body went rigid as he saw Rachel sitting in the shadows. The practiced, cheerful light in his eyes vanished, replaced by a calculating squint. He shifted his weight, staring at her. But Rachel remained as still as a statue, her eyes dark pits of accusation. Rachel slowly pushed the ring toward the edge of the table, making sure the light hit the orange residue. Her voice was flat like the rustle of dry leaves as she whispered the name of the chemical plant in Ohio. She asked him how often Leo and Emma played in the garden he had built from her stolen dreams. Each word fell into the silence like a stone into a well, Thomas opened his mouth to speak, but his eyes darted between the ring and her face, his mind visibly racing to construct a new lie that could bridge the gap between his two worlds. The muscles in Thomas's jaw bunched, and his face suddenly flushed a deep, angry crimson. The mask of the doting husband didn't just slip. It shattered. He ripped the heavy duffel bag from his shoulder and, with a guttural roar, hurled it at the wall. The bag struck the center of their framed wedding portrait. The glass exploded into 1,000 shards that rained down onto the floor, slicing through the image of their younger, smiling selves. Thomas stood there, chest heaving, his fists clenched as the dust he had kicked up swirled around him in the dim light. Thomas lunged forward, slamming his hands onto the table and looming over her. His voice broke into a jagged scream as he accused her of being a millstone around his neck. He struck the table again, making the plates jump. He spat out that she had chosen to rot in this town, clinging to ruins and empty promises while he was out creating a real future. He told her she was becoming a gray shadow, just like the rest of Steel Valley, and that he had built a life where people actually lived. His rage filled the room, hot and suffocating. He rounded the table and grabbed Rachel by the shoulders, wrenching her upward. His fingers dug into the knit of her cardigan, bruising the skin beneath. He began to shake her, his face inches from hers, his breath smelling of anger and peppermint. Rachel suddenly went limp in his grasp. The frantic pulse in her neck stilled and her eyelids stopped flickering. She lifted her head and looked directly into Thomas's eyes. Her pupils were wide, but her gaze was as clear and cold as a frozen lake. This sudden, icy indifference hit Thomas harder than any scream. He felt the heat of his rage being doused by a wave of inexplicable fear. His fingers loosened involuntarily, sliding off her shoulders. In the silence that followed, his ragged breathing was the only sound, while Rachel stood perfectly still, as if she had already erased him from her mind, taking advantage of his stunned retreat. Rachel moved with a fluid, mechanical precision toward the table. Her fingers closed around her car keys, the metal chiming softly against the wood. She snatched up the thick accordion folder of documents, feeling the weight of the evidence she had gathered. She didn't look back to see his reaction, nor did she offer a single word of parting. She held the folder against her chest like a shield and walked toward the door. The rhythmic creak of the floorboards under her feet was steady and firm, cutting off any opening for Thomas to regain his footing. Rain began to lash against the windshield as Rachel slammed the car door shut. The interior smelled of old upholstery and gasoline, a sharp contrast to the cloying scent of the house. She hit the lock button, and the mechanical thud of the deadbolts severed her connection to the man standing on the porch. Outside, Thomas hammered his fist against the glass, his face distorted by a silent scream behind the sheets of water. The sound reached her as a dull, distant thud. Rachel stared straight ahead, her hands steady on the wheel. A flash of lightning illuminated his white knuckles against the window. But she didn't flinch. Rachel turned the key, and the engine rumbled to life with a determined growl. She shifted into reverse, the tires spinning momentarily in the slick, coal-stained mud of the driveway. Her headlights cut through the gloom, turning the falling rain into silver needles. She caught a final glimpse of him in the rearview mirror, standing in the red glow of her taillights. He looked small, a frantic figure dwarfed by the skeletal silhouettes of the closed factories. The mist and soot began to swallow the space between them. She pressed the gas, and the house and the man vanished into the dark. She pulled over beside a blue mailbox near the edge of town, illuminated by the flickering neon of a closed pharmacy. She pulled out a thick, padded envelope addressed to a divorce attorney in the city. The paper felt cold and damp in the night air. She ran her thumb over the seal, the adhesive that would finalize the end of a decade. With a soft metallic clank, the envelope slid into the depths of the box. The sound was final. Rachel looked at her hands and realized the orange chemical stain was gone, replaced by a lightness she hadn't felt in years. Later that morning, Rachel sat in the principal's office. The room smelled of chalk and floor wax. She took a pen and signed her resignation with a single, sweeping stroke. The ink bled slightly into the paper, marking her official exit from Steel Valley. The principal, a man who had seen the town's best days fade, silently handed her a blue folder with gold lettering, the contract for the private academy she had once turned down for Thomas. She felt the texture of the heavy paper and the faint scent of fresh ink. She nodded, tucked the folder under her arm, and walked out. Her heels clicked sharply in the empty hall. Rachel met a local realtor in a cramped booth at a Greasy Spoon diner. The air was thick with the smell of burnt coffee and old tobacco. She spread out the deed and the disclosure forms, which were already marked with coffee rings. The realtor, a man in a cheap tie who couldn't hide his desperation for a commission, watched her nervously. Rachel didn't hesitate. She signed every page, accepting a price far below market value just to ensure the sale was instantaneous. As the man scurried away with the papers, she felt no regret. The bricks and mortar of that house no longer belonged to her. She walked into a local pawn shop, where the air was still and smelled of dust. Behind the plexiglass, she placed the platinum diamond ring onto the rotating tray. In the harsh, fluorescent light, the stone looked cold and meaningless. The appraiser poked at it with a loupe, and Rachel waited with a detached calm. When he slid a thick stack of $100 bills back through the slot, she tucked them into her bag without counting them. The weight of the cash felt like a down payment on a new life. She stepped back out onto the street, the last physical tie to Thomas's perfect world gone. The sun began to crest over the jagged horizon of the valley, staining the clouds a bruised pink. Rachel stood by a rusted trash bin at the edge of the station parking lot. Her phone vibrated in her hand, the screen a constant scroll of missed calls and frantic texts from Thomas. She didn't read them. She held the power button until the screen went black, then dropped the device into the bin. It hit the bottom with a hollow thud. She was untraceable now, a ghost to the man who had tried to rewrite her. She turned her back on the trash and walked toward the tracks. On the platform, the air smelled of wet iron and diesel. Rachel gripped the handle of her suitcase, feeling its solid, honest weight. A distant whistle echoed from the mills, but it sounded like a memory rather than a command. She took a deep breath, and for the first time, her lungs didn't burn with the bitterness of the valley. The air was sharp and clean. She watched the single headlight of the approaching train cut through the morning haze. The rhythmic thrum of the tracks vibrated through the soles of her boots, a heartbeat of steady, forward motion. Rachel looked down at the wooden bench where she sat. She pulled the old gold wedding ring from her pocket, the one with the orange chemical crust. In the early light, the residue looked like a strange, parasitic growth. She laid it carefully on the edge of the bench, right next to a deep gouge in the wood. She felt nothing. No grief, no anger, only a profound sense of closure. It was just a piece of ruined metal, a relic of a story that had finally reached its end. She stood up as the train screeched to a halt, and she stepped on board without looking back.